The sky over Tarn stopped being a sky at 11 minutes past dawn, and Mara Quill, who studied rocks for a living, was the first person in the colony to understand that the rocks were about to study back. The morning had begun the way every morning on Tarn began, which was to say, slowly and coldly, and without any sense that it was the last ordinary morning the colony would ever have. The sun came up small and white over the eastern ridges at 4 minutes before dawn, and the frost on the prefab roofs of the settlement began its slow, grudging retreat, and the colony of 3,040 people stirred awake in the long shadow of the standing range, the way it had stirred awake for 6 years. Heaters ticked, kettles warmed, the water reclamation towers hummed their low, patient hum. A shift of agricultural workers walked out under the grow domes to check the cold, hardy grain, and a teacher unlocked the single schoolhouse, and a man named Aldo Pell, who ran the colony's only proper kitchen, set out the morning bread on the long shared tables and complained, as he complained every morning, that the cold made the dough rise wrong. None of them knew that the morning bread Aldo Pell set out at 8 minutes before dawn would still be sitting on those tables, untouched and gone hard, when the colony came back out into a sky that had nearly stopped existing. Mara was not in the colony for any of it. Mara was almost never in the colony at dawn. She liked the cold early hours on the open ground, when the light was thin and the rock was honest, and so she had walked out before the sun to the eastern shelf, a long flat shoulder of stone, 2 kilometers from the settlement, where the layers of Tarn's deep past lay exposed. In a clean gray wall she had been reading like a book for 6 years. She was kneeling at the edge of the eastern shelf with a core sampler in her hands, when the blue went wrong. It did not darken, it did not cloud. It simply ceased to be blue, all at once, from horizon to horizon, replaced by a flat gray nothing, that was not a color at all, but the absence of the idea of color, as if some vast hand had reached down and erased the concept of the sky and left only the place where it used to be. Mara stood up very slowly. Her instruments had gone silent. Not broken. Silent. The way a room goes silent when something enters that should not exist. "That's not weather," she said, to no one, because there was no one near her on the eastern shelf, only the wind, and the wind too had stopped, and the silence of a world with no wind is a silence that gets into your bones. Above the gray that had been the sky, shapes were forming. They were wrong in a way Mara's eyes refused to hold. They were not ships. Ships have edges, hulls, a sense of being objects in space. These were folds in the gray, places where the nothing creased and deepened, and where they creased the laws of the world bent with them, so that a rock near Mara's foot drifted upward for a moment, and then fell sideways, and a pool of meltwater froze and boiled at the same time, and her own shadow stretched long, and then folded back into her like a thing ashamed of itself. She had read about them. Everyone had read about them, the way you read about a disease you are sure you will never catch. The unmakers, the hollow geometry, the thing that did not conquer worlds because conquering was too crude, too physical, too bound to the rules. The unmakers did not invade, they edited. They arrived at a world, and they rewrote the rules the world ran on, gently at first, a drifting rock, a confused shadow, and then completely, until the world was no longer a world, but a corrected mistake, a place where the unmaker's geometry had replaced the local one, and nothing that had lived there could go on living, because the rules it had lived by no longer applied. They had unmade 40 worlds. Mara knew the number, because everyone knew the number, the way everyone knows the number of a tragedy too large to feel. 40 worlds, each of them simply edited out of the rules and into the hollow geometry, and not one of them had ever fought back, because you cannot fight a thing that changes what fighting means. There was a record of those 40 worlds, though no human had written it. The unmakers kept it, in whatever way a thing like the unmakers kept anything, not as a list of names, but as a settled certainty, a deep and total confidence that ran through the hollow geometry, the way grain runs through wood. The first world they had unmade had been a green and crowded place, whose people had built towers and fleets and weapons enough to crack a moon, and the unmakers had not touched a single tower or fired a single shot. They had simply reached into the rule that said a falling thing falls down, and they had revised it, and the towers had drifted apart into the dark, and the people in them had drifted with them, baffled to the last, dying of a change in a law they had never thought to defend, because they had never imagined a law could be attacked. The Unmakers had felt, if they felt anything, a kind of quiet completion. A correction made, an error resolved. The second world had fought, in its own way. Its people had seen what came for them, and they had thrown everything they had at the folds in their sky, and the Unmakers had let it all come, because weapons were beside the point. You cannot shoot a rule. You cannot bomb a definition. The fleets of the second world had hurled their fire into the gray, and the gray had drunk it without changing, and then the Unmakers had reached into the rule that said time moves forward, and the second world's last hour had simply never finished happening, looping and thinning and fraying, until the people in it stopped. Mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-scream, frozen in a moment, the universe had stopped bothering to continue. That was the day the Unmakers learned the lesson they would carry to all 40 worlds, and that they believed, with total certainty, would carry them through Tarn, that the harder a world fought, the less it mattered, because fighting belonged to the old rules, and the Unmakers were not bound by the old rules. They were the new rules, they were the correction, and a correction does not lose to the thing it is correcting. By the 20th world they had stopped expecting resistance to mean anything. By the 40th, they had stopped expecting resistance at all. They moved through the quiet end of the galaxy like a hand moving down a page, finding the small, loud living errors and resolving them, one world at a time. And in all of it, they had never once met a thing that could take what they did and do it back. They did not know the word for such a thing, because there had never been one. They had no defense against it, because they had never needed a defense. They had unmade 40 worlds, and the 41st, a small cold colony on a small cold world at the quiet end of nowhere, looked from the gray like every other error they had ever resolved. They began the correction at 11 minutes past dawn, the way they had begun 40 before it, with the small, confident gentleness of a thing that has never been wrong. And now, they were over Tarn, 11 minutes past dawn, and Mara Quill stood alone on the eastern shelf and watched her sky become a correction. Her comm crackled, which surprised her, because she had assumed the Unmakers would have unmade comms first. Mara. It was Joel Hartley, the colony administrator, and his voice was the careful, flat voice of a man holding very still inside his own fear. Mara, where are you? Are you seeing this? Eastern Shelf, she said. I'm seeing it. Joel, the sky isn't a sky anymore. The rules are changing. There's gravity doing things gravity doesn't do. It's them. It's the Unmakers. A silence. Then Joel, very quietly. I know. They started broadcasting 4 minutes ago. Not words. Just a statement. A correction notice. Mara, they sent us a correction notice. Like we're a typo. A breath. They're going to rewrite us. The whole colony. The whole world. And there's nothing in the colony charter, nothing in any human file, that tells us what you do when the thing coming for you is going to edit the meaning of the word survive. In the colony, the correction notice had landed in 100 different ways, because the Unmakers did not begin with a single great stroke. They began with small revisions, scattered across the settlement like the first drops before a storm, and each colonist who lived through those first minutes lived through a different, impossible thing. In the colony's small landing field, a pilot named Tessa Vorn was running her pre-flight on the only atmospheric flyer Tarn owned, an old short-haul craft she had kept alive for 6 years through cold and dust and patient love, when her flyer forgot how to fly. She felt it before any instrument showed it. The craft, which had always wanted to be in the air the way a good craft does, went heavy and strange under her hands, and when she pushed the throttle, the engine spun up clean and willing, but the air outside the canopy stopped agreeing to lift her. The Unmakers had reached into the rule that said a moving wing makes a low pressure above it and a high pressure below, and they had begun, gently, to revise that rule, and Tessa Vorn felt her whole life's craft become a heavy box that wanted to be in the air and could no longer remember why the air had ever held it up. She did not panic. She powered down, the way you power down a horse that has gone wrong under you, and she sat in the cockpit of a flyer that had forgotten how to fly, and she watched the gray come down over the field, and she said, very softly, the name of every airfield she had ever flown out of, as if reciting them might remind the world how flight was supposed to work. In a small prefab home at the eastern edge of the settlement, a girl of 7, named Senny, woke up because her room had begun to stutter. That was the only word she would ever have for it. Her clock, which she had only just learned to read, was wrong in a way that frightened her more than any monster, because the numbers on it were not changing in order. She watched the same minute happen 3 times. She watched her own hand reach for her blanket, and then she was reaching for it again, the reach unspooling and resetting. A single small moment of a child reaching for warmth caught and repeated and caught again, because the unmakers had brushed against the rule that said each moment leads to the next, and in Senny's small room time had begun, gently, to stick. She called for her mother, and heard her own voice say it twice, the second time before the first had finished, and her mother came through the door, and then was coming through the door again, and Senny, who was 7, did the only thing a frightened child can do, which was to squeeze her eyes shut, and hold very still, and wait for the stuttering to stop, and trust, the way children trust, that someone larger than the thing in her room would make it stop. In the colony's medical bay, a doctor named Onyeka Adeyemi was halfway through setting the broken wrist of a maintenance worker when the rules began to change around her hands. The painkiller in her syringe was suddenly not sure whether it was a liquid or a gas. The bone she was setting drifted very slightly, in a direction that bones do not drift. A monitor that measured a heartbeat began to show the heartbeat happening in the wrong order, the contraction after the rest, the pulse before the beat. Dr. Adeyemi had spent her whole career learning the rules of the body, the deep reliable grammar of blood and bone and breath, and she watched those rules begin to soften under the gray sky, and she did the thing that the best of any profession do when the world goes wrong, which was to keep working, to hold the wrist steady, and finish the set by feel and instinct and stubbornness. Because if the rules were going to be rewritten, then she would at least make sure her patient's wrist was straight when they were. And that small refusal to stop being a doctor was, in its own way, the first act of resistance any human on Tarn performed. These were the small corrections, the unmakers learning the grammar of Tarn, the way they had learned the grammar of 40 worlds, testing each rule, finding how it bent, preparing the full and final revision, the pilot's lift, the child's minute, the doctor's heartbeat, the drifting rock at Mara's foot, and the meltwater that boiled and froze. None of it was the attack. All of it was the reading through, the careful study a thing makes of a sentence before it crosses the whole thing out. There was one revision among the small ones that frightened Mara more than the drifting rock, because it was aimed not at the world, but at the people in it, and it was the first sign of how thorough the unmakers meant to be. In the schoolhouse, a teacher named Bren Ostry was trying to keep 11 frightened children calm, and as he spoke, he discovered that he could not quite hold the thought of who he was. The unmakers, in their patient reading through, had brushed against a rule deeper than gravity and older than time. The quiet rule that says a thing is itself and not another thing. The rule that lets a person hold the single thread of their own name through all the noise of a life. And they had begun, gently, to loosen it. Bren Ostry felt his own self start to come unspooled, felt the memory of his name slide, and the faces of the children blur into one another, and then into him. Felt the boundary between Bren and not Bren begin to thin the way the boundary between water and steam thins at the boil. He gripped the edge of his desk, and he said his own name out loud, and then the names of the 11 children, one by one, slowly, holding each one like a stone in a current, because a teacher's whole work is to know who each child is, and he would not let the gray take that from him, while he still had breath to name them. It was the bravest small thing done in the colony that morning, and almost no one ever knew of it. A man holding 11 children's names against a force that had dissolved the names of 40 worlds, and it bought, perhaps, a handful of seconds, and a handful of seconds, that morning, turned out to be exactly enough. Mara looked at the gray where her sky had been, and at the folds deepening in it, and at the rock by her foot that had drifted up and fallen sideways, and she felt the particular cold terror of a person who studies the ground for a living, watching the ground forget how to be ground. And then a different feeling came over her, underneath the terror, and it was the feeling she always got when a piece of a puzzle she had been carrying for years suddenly turned and fit. 6 years of core samples. 6 years of reading the gray wall of the eastern shelf and the deep bones of the standing range, and 6 years of one small wrongness she had never been able to explain, and had eventually, the way scientists do, filed away as a thing to solve later. The mountains of the standing range did not match their own roots. She had cored them a dozen times, and every time the rock at the surface had told one story, and the rock far beneath had told another, or rather had refused to tell any story at all, because below a certain depth her samples stopped coming back as stone. They came back as nothing she could name, a dark, dense material that her instruments described and then, somehow, declined to describe, the readings sliding off it, the way her eyes were sliding off the folds in the gray sky right now. She had assumed it was an instrument fault. She had assumed it was a strange, deep ore. She had assumed, the way you assume about mountains, that mountains were mountains. And now, kneeling on the eastern shelf with the sky unmade above her, Mara Quill understood that for 6 years she had been drilling into the skin of something that had let her drill into its skin, and the dark, dense material her instruments could not describe was not ore at all, and the wrongness in her samples had never been an error. It had been a thing holding very, very still. And then the ground answered. Not the way she expected, not a tremor, not a quake, not the violence of a world coming apart. It was slower than that, and far stranger, and it began beneath the mountains. Tarn had mountains. They ran in a long spine down the center of the only continent, old and gray and weathered, and the colony had been built in their shadow because the mountains broke the wind and held the heat and made the cold world livable. The colonists had named them the Standing Range because they had always stood, and they had assumed, the way you assume about mountains, that they always would. The mountains of the Standing Range began, very slowly, to stand up. Mara felt it before she saw it, felt it through her knees and her teeth, a deep grinding shift in the bones of the world. The sound a thing makes when it has been still for a very long time and has decided, all at once, to stop. She turned from the unmade sky and looked at the spine of the continent, and she watched the nearest peak, a gray weathered mass she had climbed twice and cored a dozen times, shrug off 10,000 years of rock and snow and stand up out of the range like a sleeper sitting up in bed. It was not a mountain. It had never been a mountain. It had only been wearing a mountain, the way a thing wears a coat against the cold. And now it shed the coat, and underneath the coat was something Mara's mind could barely hold. A vast, dark shape of weathered metal, and deep paneling, and a long high crest, like the ridge of an enormous skull, a thing the size of a mountain because it had been pretending to be one, and it rose out of the standing range with the patience of a thing that had all the time in the world, and had spent every minute of 10,000 years waiting for exactly this. Down the length of the continent, the other peaks began to stand up too. The rock and snow came off them in slow avalanches that thundered down into the foothills, and where the disguise fell away, the true shapes of the sleepers stood revealed, 11 of them, each one different, and each one unmistakably kin to the others, a long sweep of dark weathered forms down the spine of the world. Some were broad and low like a thing built to brace. Some rose tall and narrow with crests that caught the dead gray light. All of them turned, slowly, the way a field of great old machines might turn if the field itself had woken, until 11 vast faces that were not faces were lifted toward the unmade sky. The thunder of the falling mountains rolled across the continent and reached the colony as a sound no human on Tarn had ever heard, a sound like a world clearing its throat. And in the settlement, 3,040 people stopped whatever small impossible thing the unmakers were doing to them, and ran to their windows and their doors to see the mountains they had lived beneath for 6 years rise up off the ground. Joel, Mara whispered into her comm. Joel, the mountains. Tell me you're seeing the mountains. I'm seeing them, Joel said, and his careful flat voice had cracked wide open. Mara, the colony's built on top of them. We built our colony on top of them, and we never knew. 11 mountains. 11. They're all standing up. What are they? What did we build our houses on? In the colony, the standing of the mountains undid the small corrections one by one, though no one understood yet why. In her stuttering room, the girl Senny opened her eyes because the stuttering had simply stopped, the minute on her clock moving forward again in honest order, her mother fully through the door at last, and gathering her up, and Senny looked past her mother's shoulder through the window at the rising dark shapes, and said, with the strange clear certainty of a child, the mountains are awake. In the schoolhouse, Bren Ostry felt his own name settle back into him, like a bone going back into joint, felt the 11 children become 11 separate children again, instead of a blur, and he stopped reciting the names, because the rule that held the names was holding again on its own. In the landing field, Tessa Vorn felt her dead flyer settle on its struts, and did not understand why she suddenly believed, against all the evidence of the last 10 minutes, that the air outside her canopy would hold a wing again. In the medical bay, Dr. Adiemi watched the heartbeat on her monitor reorder itself, the beat coming before the pulse again the way a beat should, and she straightened up from the wrist she had refused to abandon, and looked out the small window at the 11 sleepers, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing in any medical text that had prepared her for the feeling of having the rules of the world handed back to her by a mountain. Mara Quill, who studied rocks for a living, looked at the 11 vast, dark shapes rising out of the spine of the world she had been coring for 6 years, the 11 things that had let an entire human colony build itself on their backs and never once stirred, and she understood, the way you understand a thing in your body before your mind can catch up, that the rocks had been studying back the whole time. "I don't know what they are," she said, "but I know what they're doing. They waited, Joel. They were here before us. They let us build on them. They've been lying still under the snow for 10,000 years. She watched the nearest one finish rising, watched the gray crest of it turn, slowly, toward the unmade sky, toward the folds in the gray, toward the unmakers. And they only stood up when the unmakers came. Joel, they weren't sleeping under our colony by accident. They were sleeping under our colony on purpose. They were waiting for these things. They've been waiting for these things for 10,000 years. She did not yet know how right she was, and she would never know the whole of it, because the whole of it was older than any human record, and written in no language a human could read. But the 11 sleepers of Tarn had a history, and it was a history of exactly this. They had not grown out of Tarn's rock. They had been brought to it, long before the first human ever charted the quiet end of nowhere, by a people whose name was lost and whose worlds were gone, a people who had met the unmakers early, when the hollow geometry was young and hungry, and the count of unmade worlds was still small. That lost people had understood, faster than anyone since, the one terrible truth about the unmakers that no weapon could answer. That you cannot defeat a thing that rewrites the rules by fighting inside the rules, because the rules are the very ground it stands on. And so they had not built weapons, they had built answers. They had built 11 vast, patient things, whose entire nature was not to attack, and not to defend, but to receive. To take any rewriting of reality poured into them, and hold it whole, and give it back unchanged in every line except its direction, so that the editor would meet, at last and for the first time, its own edit coming the other way. The lost people had built the 11, and they had known they could not win their own war, that the unmakers would come for them before the sleepers were ready, and so they had done the bravest and saddest thing a dying people can do. They had sent their answer away. They had buried the 11 on a cold world at the quiet end of nowhere, far from any path the unmakers were likely to walk, and they had told them to sleep, and to wear mountains, and to wait, not for a year or a century, but for as long as it took, until the day the hollow geometry finally turned down that quiet road, and gave the sleepers the one thing they had been built to need, which was an enemy committed fully enough to be turned around. Then the lost people had gone back to their own sky to be unmade, knowing they would never see whether their answer worked, trusting it to a future they would not live in, on a world they had never named. 10,000 years later, the future arrived. 11 minutes past dawn, over a colony of 3,040 people who had built their homes on the answer and called it a mountain range. The first of the standing mountains opened its eyes, and the eyes were not eyes. They were apertures, deep and old and lined with a light that was not quite any color. And where the light touched the unmade gray of the sky, the gray flinched. That was the word Mara would use afterward, the only word that fit. The sky flinched. The hollow geometry, the thing that had rewritten 40 worlds, the thing that edited the rules of reality the way a careless hand edits a sentence, touched the light from the standing mountain and pulled back, the way you pull your hand from a stove, and for one instant, in the place where the light met the gray, the sky remembered how to be blue. And then the war began, and it was not a war of weapons, because the unmakers had no weapons and the mountains needed none. It was a war of rules. The Unmakers had come to Tarn to rewrite it. That was what they did. They reached into the deep grammar of a world, the laws that said up was up, and a rock was a rock, and a moment followed the moment before it. And they edited those laws into their own hollow geometry, and the world, no longer able to be itself, simply stopped. They had begun the edit at 11 minutes past dawn. The drifting rock, the confused shadow, the water that boiled and froze. These were not attacks. These were the first small corrections. The Unmakers testing the local rules, learning the grammar of Tarn so they could rewrite it. And the mountains of Tarn, the 11 vast dark sleepers that had worn the standing range for 10,000 years, stood up into the half-finished edit and began, line by line, to rewrite it back. Mara could not see the war directly, because the war was happening in a place her eyes were not built to look, in the deep rules underneath the world. But she could see the consequences, and the consequences were the strangest and most beautiful and most terrifying things any human being had ever watched. She watched the rock by her foot, which had drifted up and fallen sideways under the Unmaker's edit, settle slowly back to the ground and stay there, because one of the standing mountains had reached into the grammar of Tarn and rewritten the rule of gravity back to what it had always been. She watched her own shadow, which had folded into her in shame, stretch back out across the eastern shelf in the honest old way a shadow should. She watched the pool of meltwater stop boiling and freezing at once, and simply be water, cold and clear, and obedient to the rules it had always obeyed, because something the size of a mountain had decided that on Tarn, water would go on being water, no matter what the sky said. The Unmakers pushed, the mountains pushed back, and the sky over Tarn became a battleground of competing realities, a place where the gray of the hollow geometry warred with the blue of the world that refused to be erased, and the line between them moved back and forth across the heavens like a tide. Mara, who had spent 6 years learning that the deep rules of a world change so slowly that a human life cannot watch them move, knelt on the eastern shelf and watched the deep rules of her world change 100 times a minute, and she understood that she was seeing something no scientist in any human record had ever seen. The grammar of reality itself fought over like ground in a war, and she did the only thing a scientist can do in the presence of the impossible, which was to keep her eyes open and try to remember everything, so that if anyone lived through this morning, there would be one person who could say what had truly happened in the sky over Tarn. The first phase of the war was a war over color, and it was the gentlest of all the phases, and it was the only one most of the colony could bear to watch. The Unmakers had taken color first, had reached into the rule that said light split into hues, and had flattened it to gray, and so the mountains gave color back, but they did not give it back all at once. They gave it back the way a thing gives back something precious it has held in trust, carefully, deliberately, a hue at a time. Mara watched the blue return to one patch of sky directly above the nearest sleeper, a small honest circle of true Tarn blue in the dead gray, and then she watched the Unmakers reach for that circle and pull the blue out of it again, and then she watched the mountain pour it back, deeper this time, and the circle held. Across the colony, people who had only minutes before been living through stuttering time and forgotten flight came out into the open and tipped their faces up and watched the 11 sleepers fight, hue by hue, for the right of their sky to have a color, and Aldo Pell the cook stood among them, with flour still on his hands, and wept openly at the sight of a single returning streak of dawn red over the eastern ridges, the first color anyone had given back to a world the Unmakers had touched in 40 tries. The second phase was a war over weight, and it was harder, because the Unmakers had learned from the colors that the mountains would contest every rule, and so they stopped testing and began to commit. They drove down on the rule of gravity across the whole continent, not gently now, and Mara felt the ground try to let go of her, felt her own body grow light and uncertain, felt the loose stones of the eastern shelf begin to lift, like a slow gray snow falling upward. In the colony, the same thing happened all at once. Tools rose off workbenches. The morning bread lifted off Aldo Pell's long tables. The girl Seni, gathered safe in her mother's arms, felt the two of them begin to drift toward the ceiling, and her mother grabbed the doorframe and held on, and across the settlement 3,000 people grabbed whatever was bolted down and held on, while the world tried to forget how to keep them. And then the mountains answered, 11 voices reaching into the rule of weight and holding it open by main force. and the upward snow of stones stopped and hung trembling, and then came back down, and the bread settled onto the tables, and Seni and her mother sank gently back to the floor, and the rule that said a colony of 3,040 people would stay on the ground they lived on was, for the moment, restored. Mara, kneeling and gripping the rock, understood that the mountains had not merely undone the edit. They had gotten there first. The next time the Unmakers reached for gravity, the rule was already braced. The third phase was a war over time, and it was the worst, and it was the one that nearly broke the colony's nerve, because there is no terror like the terror of a moment that will not pass. The Unmakers, blocked on color and weight, reached down into the deepest rule of all, the rule that one moment leads to the next, the rule Seni's room had only sipped at in the first minutes, and they took hold of it across all of Tarn, and the world began to stick. Mara felt her own breath catch in a loop, the same single inhale beginning over and over, the eastern shelf around her shuddering, as the same instant tried to happen again. In the colony, the medical bay's monitors flatlined, not because hearts had stopped, but because time around the hearts had stopped. The patients caught between one beat and the next, and Dr. Adeyemi felt herself reaching for an instrument, and reaching for it again, and reaching for it again, a doctor trapped in the act of trying to help, and she would say later that it was the most frightening thing in her life. Not pain, not death, but the loss of the next moment, the universe declining to let the present become the past. And then the 11 sleepers of Tarn reached into the stuck rule together, and Mara felt time tear free and lurch forward, felt the looped instant suddenly continue, felt the present become the past the way it was meant to, and across the colony 3,040 people gasped a breath that had been held too long, and felt the future arrive again, and Seni laughed out loud in her mother's arms, because the worst thing that had happened to her that morning was over, and the mountains had ended it. It was in the war over time that the colony came closest to losing one of the sleepers, and Mara saw it happen and did not understand, until much later, how near the whole world had come to ending in that one moment. The Unmakers, finding the 11 braced against them everywhere, did the thing a clever attacker does when it cannot break a line, which was to stop spreading its force and gather it all against a single point. They chose the sleeper at the southern end of the range, the broad, low one that Mara had always thought of as the oldest, and they brought the entire weight of the stuck time edit down on it alone. All of the hollow geometry that had been spread thin across the continent suddenly focused on one dark, patient shape, and Mara, watching from the eastern shelf, saw the southern sleeper begin to falter. Its aperture, which had blazed steady with the not-quite color light, began to flicker, the way a lamp flickers when the current behind it fails, and the patch of sky above it, which the 11 had won back to blue, began to gray over again, and the deep grinding note that ran up through the bones of the world from that one sleeper began, for the first time, to waver. The southern sleeper was being overwhelmed. One mountain, no matter how patient, no matter how deep, could not hold the entire focused will of the thing that had unmade 40 worlds, and the Unmakers, sensing at last a place where the line might break, poured everything they had into the breaking of it. And then the other 10 sleepers did a thing the Unmakers had not planned for, because the Unmakers had never fought a thing that could help another thing. They did not abandon their own patches of the war to save the southern one, because abandoning the line would have let the edit flood through everywhere at once. Instead, each of the 10 reached, just slightly, sideways, lending the southern sleeper not its whole strength but a thread of it, 10 thin threads of borrowed rule running down the spine of the continent into the one faltering shape, so that the southern sleeper, which alone could not have held, was suddenly not alone, was braced by 10 others, each giving what it could spare and no more, and the flickering aperture steadied, and the graying patch of sky went blue again, and the wavering note found its pitch. Mara watched the line of light run down the range from sleeper to sleeper, and she understood, dimly, that she was watching the 11 learn, in the middle of the only battle they had ever fought, how to be more than 11 separate things, and that the lesson they were learning under fire was the exact lesson the lost people had built into them and never lived to see, the lesson that would matter most of all when the gray came down in full. Mara, Joel's voice, awed and shaking. Mara, the sky, it's fighting. The gray's pushing down and the blue's pushing back, and the line keeps moving. What's happening? What are they doing? They're arguing, Mara said, and she did not know how she knew it, but she knew it the way she knew the age of a rock from its layers. The Unmakers are trying to rewrite the rules of Tarn into their geometry, and the mountains are rewriting them back. It's not a battle, Joel. It's an argument about what's true, about what the rules of this world are going to be. She watched the line of gray and blue surge and recede. And we're standing inside the argument. We're the thing they're arguing about. For the Unmakers, the argument was a thing that should not have been possible, and the impossibility of it moved through the hollow geometry like the first crack through ice. In 40 worlds, they had reached into a rule and revised it, and the rule had stayed revised, because that was what rules did when the Unmakers touched them. They had never met a rule that pushed back. They had never met a thing that reached into the same rule from the other side and held it, that contested a definition, that argued. The folds in the gray deepened and multiplied as the Unmakers brought more of themselves to bear, more of the certainty that had unmade 40 worlds, and still the 11 dark things on the spine of the small cold world met every edit with a counter-edit, gravity with gravity, time with time, gray with blue. The Unmakers did the only thing their long, unbroken history had taught them to do when a correctee. The Unmakers, in the unmade gray, gathered themselves. Mara felt it as a deepening of the folds, a concentration of the wrongness, as the thing that had unmade 40 worlds stopped testing the grammar of Tarn and committed, all at once, to the full edit, the complete rewrite, the correction it had performed 40 times before and never once failed to complete. The gray came down like a falling ceiling. It came down over the whole continent, over the colony, over the eastern shelf where Mara stood, the hollow geometry descending in full force to rewrite the world in a single stroke. And where it came down, the rules died ahead of it. Gravity unspooling, time stuttering, the very air forgetting how to be air. Mara felt her own body begin to come unwritten, felt the rules that held her together start to soften at the edges, felt, for one endless instant, what it was to be a sentence the universe was erasing. In the colony, the falling ceiling reached down into every home and every street and every life at once, and for one endless instant, 3,040 people felt what Mara felt on the eastern shelf, felt the rules that made them softening, felt themselves beginning to come unwritten. The girl Senny felt her mother's arms around her start to lose the meaning of arms. Tessa Vorn, standing now beside her dead flyer with her face turned up, felt the ground beneath her boots forget the meaning of ground. Dr. Adeyemi, in the medical bay, felt the rule that separated her from her patients, and her patients from the air, begin to dissolve, felt the edges of every person in the room start to run together into the gray, and she did the last thing a doctor can do when there is nothing left to do, which was to take the hand of the patient nearest her and hold it, so that whatever came next, the patient would not face it alone. Across the whole colony, people reached for each other in the final instant, parents for children, and friends for friends, and strangers for strangers. 3,040 people, taking hold of one another beneath a falling sky, refusing, even as they were erased, to be erased alone. And that refusal, small and human and bound to the old rules, was not what saved them. But it was what the mountains were saving. And the 11 mountains of Tarn answered with one voice. They had been arguing politely, until then, 11 separate sleepers, each rewriting its own patch of the world's grammar, holding the line against the edit. But when the gray came down in full, the 11 stopped being 11. They joined. Mara felt it as a single vast harmonizing note that came up through the bones of the world and the bones of her body at once. A note that was not sound but rule, the 11 sleepers of Tarn locking their voices together into a single statement about the nature of reality. And the statement was simple, and it was final, and it was this. On Tarn, the rules are ours. The joining was the thing the lost people had built into the 11 and never lived to see work. Apart, each sleeper was an answer to one edit, strong enough to hold a patch of the world. Together, they were a single answer to the whole of the hollow geometry, and the joining ran down the spine of the continent, like a cord struck across 11 strings, the apertures of all 11 brightening at once into a single shared light, the dark weathered forms aligning toward the falling ceiling as one. Mara felt the note in her teeth, and her bones, and the soles of her feet, felt it pass through the colony, and the continent, and the deep roots of the world, felt 11 things that had each waited alone for 10,000 years, stop waiting, and stop being alone, and become, for the first time since the lost people made them, the one whole thing they had been built to be. The colonists felt it too, every one of them, a deep, impossible harmony rising up through the ground they stood on, and the people who had been holding each other against the end felt the end stop coming, felt the 11 voices slide under them like a hand under a falling child, and the medical bay's monitors, which had flatlined under the stuck time, began one by one to find their patients' hearts again. The gray ceiling stopped falling. It stopped 100 meters above the colony, 100 meters above the eastern shelf, 100 meters above Mara Quill's softening body, and it hung there, straining, the full force of the hollow geometry that had unmade 40 worlds pressing down against the single-joined voice of 11 things that had worn mountains for 10,000 years. And for a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. The edit and the world locked together, neither giving. The whole question of whether Tarn would go on existing, balanced on a knife edge, 100 meters over Mara's head. The colony stood frozen beneath it. No one ran, because there was nowhere to run, and no one screamed, because the moment was too large for screaming, and 3,040 people simply stood in the dim gray light, 100 meters under the weight of the thing that had ended 40 worlds, and looked up, and held each other, and waited to learn what they were. Joel Hartley stood among them on the open ground, having left the compost to be with his people, and he found Mara was still in his ear, and he said, very quietly, so that only she would hear, "If this is the end of us, Mara, then we were the colony that made them stand up. 40 worlds and not one of them ever made anything stand up. Whatever happens now, we did that." And Mara, kneeling on the eastern shelf with her body half unwritten and the gray ceiling straining 100 meters above her, found that she was not afraid anymore, because Joel was right, and because beneath the terror, she could feel the joined note of the 11 holding, not giving an inch. The patience of 10,000 years braced against the full weight of the hollow geometry, and she knew, the way she knew the age of a rock, that a thing that had waited that long to push had not stood up in order to lose. And then the mountains began to push the gray back up. Slowly, meter by meter, the way a thing pushes back a weight that has it pinned, the way a wrestler bridges up from underneath. The 11 joined sleepers of Tarn took the full descending edit of the Unmakers, and stopped it and held it, and then, impossibly, began to reverse it, pushing the hollow geometry back up off their world, rewriting the world's grammar back to itself, faster than the Unmakers could unwrite it. And where the world won back its own rules, the gray peeled away and the blue came back, honest and ordinary and unspeakably beautiful, a sky remembering how to be a sky. The colony watched the gray lift off them meter by meter, and as it lifted, the rules came home, one by one. Where the blue returned, weight returned with it, and people felt themselves settle firmly onto the ground that was ground again. Where the blue returned, time returned, the honest forward flow of one moment into the next, and the held breath of 3,000 people let go at last. Where the blue returned, the very air remembered it was air, and the colony breathed it in, cold and thin and sweet, the most ordinary air in the galaxy, and the most precious. And the girl Senny, set down at last on her own 2 feet, looked up through her window at the lifting gray and the widening blue, and said again, with the same clear certainty, "The mountains are winning," and her mother, who had held her against the end of the world, found that she believed her. Mara felt her own body firm up around her, felt the rules that held her together lock back into place, felt herself become, once again, a thing the universe had decided to keep. She fell to her knees on the eastern shelf, not from fear now but from the sheer overwhelming relief of being real, and she watched the blue chase the gray back up into the heavens, and she wept, the way you weep when you have been erased and then, against all reason, written back. But the Unmakers were not finished, because the Unmakers had never been finished by anything, and what they did next was the thing that turned the day from a defense into a legend. They tried to unmake the mountains. It was the obvious move, the only move, the move that had never failed. The mountains were rewriting Tarn's rules back faster than the Unmakers could edit them, so the Unmakers turned their full geometry on the mountains themselves, on the 11 sleepers, to rewrite them out of existence, to edit the editors, to erase the only things on Tarn that could fight an erasure. The gray gathered and focused and came down, Not on the colony now, but on the 11 standing shapes along the spine of the continent. The full unmaking force of the thing that had ended 40 worlds, aimed at 11 mountains that had stood up. In the moment the unmakers turned, the colony understood, before Mara did, what was being asked of the sleepers. The gray lifted entirely off the settlement, off the fields and the homes, and the upturned faces, and gathered itself into a single vast descending column aimed at the spine of the continent, at the 11 dark shapes that had just finished pushing it off the world. The colonists, suddenly safe, suddenly spared, stood in their own restored blue and watched the full weight of the hollow geometry fall away from themselves and onto the things that had protected them, and a terrible understanding moved through the crowd, the understanding that they were being saved at a cost they could not pay, and the mountains apparently could. And Aldo Pell, who had wept at the first red streak of dawn, now wept differently. The way you weep, watching someone step in front of a thing meant for you, and 3,040 people turned from their own returned sky to watch the unmakers throw everything they had at the 11 sleepers of Tarn. And the mountains let it come. Mara watched, uncomprehending, as the 11 sleepers stopped pushing the gray back and instead opened themselves to it. Let the full hollow geometry pour down onto them. Let the unmakers begin the edit that would rewrite them out of the rules. She did not understand. It looked like surrender. It looked like the mountains giving up, letting themselves be erased, and her heart, which had only just learned it was going to live, broke for the 11 things that had saved her. "No," she whispered. "No, don't let them take you. Push back, push back." But the mountains did not push back. They drank. That was the thing Mara understood last, the thing that no one on 40 unmade worlds had ever lived to understand, because the unmakers had only ever edited things that could be edited. The mountains of Tarn could not be edited. They had not worn mountains for 10,000 years, and waited for this day in order to be rewritten. They had waited in order to be ready, and what they had made themselves ready for was this exact moment. The moment the unmakers committed their full geometry to a single target, and the mountains opened themselves and let the entire unmaking force of the hollow geometry pour into them, and they did not break, and they did not bend, and they did not unwrite. This was the answer the lost people had built, 10,000 years and a galaxy away, the answer they had died without seeing work. They had understood that there is only one way to defeat a thing that turns your every defense into part of its argument, and it is not to defend at all. It is to receive. It is to make yourself into a thing so deep, and so patient, and so perfectly empty, that any rewriting poured into you simply fills you, and does not change you, the way the sea is not changed by a storm poured into it, the way the night is not changed by a single light. The 11 sleepers of Tarn were that depth, that patience, that emptiness, 11 vessels built for exactly one purpose, to take the unholdable and hold it. And so when the unmakers committed the full geometry of 40 worlds to the unmaking of the 11 did the one thing the hollow geometry had no answer for. They accepted it, they opened, and they took it in, all of it, and they were not unmade, because you cannot unmake a thing whose whole nature is to be the place where unmaking goes. They absorbed it. They took the rules the unmakers were trying to impose, the whole vast hollow geometry, the grammar of 40 dead worlds, and they pulled it down into themselves the way a deep cold sea pulls down a storm, and they held it, all of it, every line of the edit that had ended 40 worlds, gathered into 11 things that had been built, 10,000 years ago, for exactly the purpose of holding the unholdable. And the unmakers, somewhere in the descent, understood that something was wrong. Mara felt it as a hesitation in the falling gray, a stutter in the certainty, the first time all morning the hollow geometry had paused of its own accord. The edit they were pouring into the mountains was not staying poured. It was going somewhere. It was going down, into the 11, and not coming back as ruin, and the unmakers, which had never once in 40 worlds had to wonder where their own force had gone, felt the bottom drop out of the certainty that had carried them across a galaxy. For the first time, the thing that edited reality met a place its edit simply disappeared into, and a thing that has never lost track of its own power does not know what to do when its power stops arriving where it is aimed. The folds in the gray wavered. The descending column thinned, and somewhere in the deep wrong heart of the hollow geometry, a question formed that the unmakers had no grammar to ask. The question that every dying world they had ever made had asked and never been answered. The simple disbelieving, where is it going? Mara watched the apertures of the 11 sleepers blaze with a light that was no longer not quite a color but every color at once. The gathered weight of the entire hollow geometry pouring into them and being held. And she understood at last that this had never been a surrender, that the opening of the mountains had been the last and oldest part of a plan a dying people had made before the first human ever walked, that the sleepers had spent 10,000 years not waiting to fight, but waiting to receive, because receiving was the fight, and the unmakers had just given them, freely and fully, and with the total confidence of a thing that had never once been wrong, the entire force they had used to end 40 worlds. The 11 drank it down, and the colony watched the spine of the continent fill with light, 11 dark shapes blazing brighter and brighter as they took into themselves a thing no world had ever survived, and held it, and did not break. And then they gave it back. The 11 sleepers of Tarn took the full geometry of the unmakers, the complete unmaking, and they turned it around, and they wrote it back into the sky, back into the folds, back into the hollow geometry itself. The editors edited with their own edit, the rule breakers broken by their own broken rules. Mara watched the gray in the sky convulse, watched the folds of the unmakers crease and deepen, and then begin to come apart. Watched the thing that had rewritten 40 worlds meet, for the first time in its long unmade existence, a thing that could take what it dealt and return it with interest. The returning came in stages, and Mara saw every one of them, and she would spend the rest of her long life trying to find words for what she saw. The first stage was the turning. The instant the light in the 11 apertures stopped pouring in, and began to pour out, the gathered geometry reversing its direction, 10,000 years of patience releasing in a single rising tide. The second stage was the recognition, and this was the strangest of all, because Mara felt, through the bones of the world, the unmakers recognized their own edit coming back at them, felt the hollow geometry meet the hollow geometry, felt the thing that had never once met its own reflection look into a mirror at last, and not know what it was seeing. The third stage was the doubt, the first doubt in the entire history of the unmakers, the first crack in a certainty that had unmade 40 worlds, as the folds in the gray faltered, and the descending column of unmaking stopped descending, and the thing that had never been wrong felt, for one instant, the possibility of being wrong. And the fourth stage was the breaking, the moment the returned edit reached the unmakers in full, and they had no rule to meet it, no defense, no counter, no answer, because they had spent their entire existence so certain they would never need one, that they had never made one, and the grammar of 40 dead worlds came home to the thing that had written it. The sky screamed. Not in sound, in rule. The hollow geometry, suddenly subject to its own grammar, began to unmake itself, the folds turning inward, the gray collapsing into the gray, the unmaker's own correction running backward through the unmakers, and Mara Quill knelt on the eastern shelf of a small cold world, at the quiet end of nowhere, and watched 11 mountains rewrite the unwritable thing out of her sky. And then the unmakers did the last thing, the thing that no one in 40 worlds had ever seen them do, because no one in 40 worlds had ever made them do it. They tried to leave. Mara felt it through the ground, felt the folds in the gray begin to pull upward and away, the hollow geometry trying to lift itself off Tarn and flee back into the dark it had come from, to disconnect from the edit that was eating it, and escape with whatever remained of itself. It was the move of a thing that had finally understood it was losing, the first retreat in the history of the unmakers. And it very nearly worked, because a thing built only to attack has no skill at fleeing, but a great deal of motive. The gray thinned and rose, and began to peel back toward the heavens, away from the world, away from the 11, toward escape. The mountains did not let it go. This was the part the lost people had understood best of all, and built into the 11 most carefully, because they had known that an enemy committed fully enough to be turned around would, the instant it felt the turning, try to break the commitment and run, and that to let it run would be to face it again someday, over some other world that had no sleepers beneath it. So the 11 had been built not only to receive and return but to hold, to keep the connection open once the unmakers had given themselves to it, to refuse to release a thing that had reached all the way into them. And so when the hollow geometry tried to lift off Tarn, it found that it could not, that the edit it had poured into the 11 had become a tether, that the more of itself it had committed, the more of itself was now caught, and the harder it pulled to flee, the more of its own return geometry came with it, chasing it up into the dark, unwriting it as it climbed. The Unmakers fled, and their own edit fled after them, faster than they could run from it, because it was them, and a thing cannot outrun itself. Mara watched the gray tear upward toward the stars, and watched the light of the 11 follow it all the way, a long bright lash of returned rule cracking up through the heavens after the fleeing folds, and she understood that the mountains were not merely defending Tarn anymore. They were finishing the thing the lost people had died to start. They were making sure the Unmakers did not leave Tarn the way they had left 40 worlds, intact and certain, and free to do it again. The whole colony watched it. 3,040 people stood in their returned blue, and watched the gray above the spine of the continent fold in on itself, watched the folds that had been the Unmakers crease and deepen, and turn inward, and begin to consume themselves. Watch the thing that had been certainty become confusion, and the confusion become collapse. There was no sound to it, no thunder, no fire, only a vast silent unraveling in the high air, the hollow geometry being edited out of existence by the exact force it had brought to edit out a world, and the colonists, who had no words for what they were seeing, fell silent and still, and simply bore witness, because some things are too large to do anything but witness. The girl Senny watched it from her window, and did not laugh now, only watched, wide-eyed, the way you watch the end of a storm. Tessa Vorn watched it from beside her flyer. Dr. Adeyemi watched it from the door of the medical bay, with the hand of her patient still in hers. And Aldo Pell watched it with flour on his hands, and did not weep at all this time, because the time for weeping was past, and what came up in him instead was something older and stronger and quieter, the feeling a person has when they have looked at the thing that was going to end everything they loved, and watched it end instead. It did not take long, in the end. The Unmakers had built their entire existence on the certainty that nothing could resist an edit, and so they had never built any defense against being edited, because they had never once needed one. They had unmade 40 worlds, and never met a thing that could unmake them back, and the first thing that could ended them in the time it takes a storm to break, because the mountains of Tarn returned 10,000 years of patient readiness in a single overwhelming stroke, and the hollow geometry, for all that it had rewritten the rules of 40 worlds, had no rule that let it survive its own reflection. The gray peeled back off the sky, all of it. The folds came apart and the wrongness drained away, and the flat, colorless nothing that had been the heavens at 11 minutes past dawn became, once more, a sky, blue and honest and ordinary, and the most beautiful thing Mara Quill had ever seen. And over the spine of the continent, the 11 sleepers of Tarn stood in the new clean light, vast and dark and weathered, and they had not moved, and they had not fired a shot, and they had ended the thing that ended worlds by the simple act of being unable to be ended themselves. The colony came out into the light, slowly, the way people come out after a storm they were sure would kill them. Joel Hartley walked out onto the open ground beneath the standing mountains, and Mara came down off the eastern shelf to meet him, and the two of them stood together with the whole colony, 3,040 people, and looked up at the 11 things they had built their homes upon and never known. The colonists came out one by one, and then in families, and then in a great slow gathering, drawn to the open ground beneath the sleepers, as if pulled there, and no one had called a meeting, and no one had given an order, but every soul on Tarn came, because there are moments a community must stand together inside of, or it is not a community at all. Tessa Vorn came from the landing field, leaving her flyer that would fly again. Dr. Adeyemi came from the medical bay, her patients steady and breathing behind her. Bren Austri came from the schoolhouse with his 11 children, every one of them holding a name that was firmly their own again. Aldo Pell came from his kitchen, with the morning bread gone hard on the tables behind him, and he would joke about that bread for the rest of his life, the bread that survived the end of the world by being too cold to eat. And Senny came holding her mother's hand, a girl of 7 who had watched time stutter in her own small room, and then watched it healed, and who would grow up to be the first person born of the colony to truly understand what they lived on, because she had been young enough to take the impossible at face value, and old enough to remember it whole. They gathered on the open ground, 3,040 people, and they looked up. They were here first, Joel said quietly. All this time, we thought we were the first thing to live on Tarn. We built our colony on the backs of war gods, and we called them mountains, and we never knew. They knew, Mara said. They knew we were here. They let us build. They let 3,000 people live on their backs for 6 years, and never stirred, because stirring would have given them away, and they were waiting. She looked at the nearest sleeper, at the deep apertures that had flinched the sky into remembering it was blue. They've been waiting for the Unmakers for 10,000 years, Joel, maybe longer. Whoever built them knew the Unmakers would come, someday, somewhere, and they built 11 things that could take an edit and give it back, and they buried them under a mountain range on a cold world, at the quiet end of nowhere, and they told them to sleep, and to wear mountains, and to wait. A breath, and the Unmakers came to the one world in 41, where the rocks could study back. The standing mountains did not speak, not in words. But as the colony watched, the nearest of them turned its great gray crest, slowly, deliberately, toward the gathered people, and the deep apertures dimmed and brightened once, the way a thing acknowledges another thing, and Mara understood that the 11 sleepers knew exactly who had been living on their backs, and had, in their long patient way, been keeping them safe the whole time. And then it turned its crest toward each of the others in turn, 11 vast forms acknowledging one another down the spine of the continent, and the colony understood that they were watching a thing finish, a thing that had been begun 10,000 years and a galaxy away by a people whose name no one would ever know. The sleepers had done what they were made to do. The answer the lost people sent into the future had arrived, and worked, and held. And the 11, having drunk the unmaking of 40 worlds and given it back, having ended the thing the lost people died to stop, did the only thing left for an answer to do, once it has been given. They prepared to rest. And then, one by one, the mountains lay back down. They did not collapse, they did not vanish. They simply settled, slowly, back into the spine of the continent, drawing the weathered gray rock and the snow back over themselves, like a sleeper pulling up a blanket, until the standing range stood once more, as it had always stood, 11 gray peaks down the center of the only continent, and a stranger arriving at Tarn would never have known that the mountains were anything but mountains, would never have guessed that under the snow lay 11 things that had eaten the thing that ate worlds. The colony watched them lie down in silence, and the silence held long after the last of the 11 had settled, and the avalanche thunder of the returning rock had rolled away across the continent and faded into the cold air. No one spoke for a long time. 3,040 people stood on the open ground and looked at the standing range, which was a mountain range again, gray and weathered and ordinary, and which would never again be ordinary to a single one of them. The sun, small and white, climbed higher into the honest blue, and the frost they had woken to that morning finished its slow retreat from the prefab roofs, and the water reclamation towers hummed their low patient hum, and the colony of Tarn, which had nearly been edited out of reality at 11 minutes past dawn, found that it was still there, every soul of it, standing on the backs of war gods on a small cold world at the quiet end of nowhere. But the colony knew. The colony would always know, and from that day the people of Tarn did a thing that no human colony had ever done before, which was to live in deliberate, grateful, careful company with the war gods under their feet. They did not dig them up. They did not try to use them. They understood, the way you understand a sleeping thing of enormous power, that the right relationship with a war god is not to wake it, but to be worthy of the fact that it chose to sleep beneath you. They kept the mountains clean. They kept the snow off the apertures. They taught their children that the standing range was not to be feared, but to be honored, that the rocks of Tarn had studied humanity for 6 years before the Unmakers came, and had decided, in whatever way a mountain decides, that the small, loud, fragile people on their backs were worth standing up for. They changed the shape of their lives around that knowledge, slowly, over years, in 100 small ways. They moved the landing field so that Tessa Vorn's flyers would never pass low over the apertures. They built no structure that would put weight or shadow on a sleeper's crest. They marked the 11 on no map and sold the location of Tarn to no broker, and welcomed every visitor with warmth, and told them nothing, because the colony had learned that some things are kept safest by the people who love them, and not by the people who would study them. Once a year, on the morning of the anniversary, at 4 minutes before dawn, The whole colony walked out to the open ground beneath the standing range and stood in silence until 11 minutes past dawn, the hour the sky had stopped being a sky, and then they went home and ate together, and Aldo Pell, and after him his apprentices, and after them their apprentices, baked fresh bread for everyone, the bread that the first morning had gone hard and untouched, and they ate it warm, because the colony had decided that the right answer to a morning that nearly ended the world was a warm loaf shared among people who had lived. There was one more test, years later, and the colony met it without the mountains ever fully waking, and that was how Tarn learned that the 11 had changed it into something more than a place that got lucky once. A single fold appeared in the sky one autumn dusk, small and tentative, not the full descending gray of the first day, but a probe, a careful finger of hollow geometry, sent by something far off, that had heard the rumor of a world that returned what it was given, and had come, cautiously, to see if the rumor was true. The colony saw it and did not panic, because the colony had learned, on the worst morning of its life, exactly what it lived on. The watchers Mara had trained sounded no alarm and called for no evacuation. They simply watched the small fold reach down toward the standing range, and they watched the nearest sleeper, without rising, without shedding its coat of rock and snow, open a single aperture beneath the surface, just enough to let one thread of not quite color light touch the probing fold. And the fold flinched, exactly as the sky had flinched on the first morning, and pulled back, and thinned, and was gone. And the autumn dusk went on being an ordinary autumn dusk, and whatever had sent the probe took from its retreat the one lesson the galaxy was slowly learning everywhere, which was that Tarn was a world you did not edit. The mountains had not even needed to stand up. The memory of the first morning, carried in the deep stone, was warning enough, and the colony slept that night under a sky that no one would ever try to rewrite again, and in the morning, Aldo Pell's apprentices baked bread, and the children walked to the schoolhouse past the quiet gray peaks, and Tarn went on. Mara Quill never cored a mountain again. She could not bring herself to. Instead, she spent the rest of her long life studying them in the only way that felt right, which was the way you study a thing you respect, from the outside, patiently, learning its moods and its seasons, mapping the slow grinding shifts that ran through the standing range, and learning to read them the way you learn to read the breathing of a sleeping friend. She found over the years that the mountains were not entirely still. They turned, very slowly, in their sleep. They turned to face the sky, and she understood that they were still watching, still waiting, still ready, because a thing built to take an edit and give it back does not stop being ready just because it won once. She went back, too, to the deep core samples that had never made sense, the dark, dense material her instruments could describe and then declined to describe, and she stopped trying to make sense of them, because she understood at last that they were not meant to make sense, that she had spent 6 years drilling into the patient skin of a war god, and the war god had simply, gently, refused to be read, the way it had refused to be read for 10,000 years. She kept the samples on a shelf in her quarters, 11 small cores from 11 sleepers, and she did not study them, and she did not throw them away. She kept them the way you keep a thing that taught you the limits of your own knowing, which is the most useful thing a scientist can ever be taught. The story of what happened over Tarn spread, the way the great stories spread, slowly and then everywhere, and it changed the way the galaxy thought about the Unmakers, because the Unmakers had been the one terror that could not be fought, the editors of reality, the unmaking force that had ended 40 worlds without ever taking a loss. And now there were not 40 unmade worlds, there were 40 unmade worlds, and one world that had stood up, one small cold colony at the quiet end of nowhere, where the mountains had risen and rewritten the unwritable thing out of the sky, and the galaxy understood, slowly, that the Unmakers were not invincible after all. They had only ever been unbeaten, which is a different thing, and the difference had been hiding under a mountain range on Tarn for 10,000 years. It did not spread as fact at first. It spread as rumor, as a thing too large to be believed, a tale carried by the few traders who called it Tarn, and came away changed, and unable to say quite why. There is a world, they said, where the Unmakers came and lost. The hearers laughed, because everyone knew the Unmakers did not lose, the way everyone knew the count of unmade worlds, the way everyone knew the things that were certain. But the traders kept coming away from Tarn with the same impossible quiet in them, and the rumor hardened into report and the report into record, and somewhere in the long telling, the galaxy stopped laughing and started to wonder, and the wondering was the beginning of the only thing that had ever frightened the Unmakers, which was a galaxy that no longer believed it could be edited without a fight. The Unmakers never came to Tarn again. They never came near it. Whatever shared sense ran through the thing that had unmade 40 worlds, it learned, in the way that even an editor of reality can learn, that there was one world in the galaxy that returned what it was given, one place where the rules belonged to the rocks, and the Unmakers, which had no defense against their own reflection, did the one thing they had never done before any of this, which was to avoid a world. They edited elsewhere, where it was safe, where the things they unmade could not unmake them back, and they never spoke of Tarn, because they had no way to speak of a defeat, because in 40 worlds of editing, they had never needed a word for it. But the Unmakers were not what they had been, after Tarn. Even where they went and won, the certainty was gone out of them, the deep-settled confidence that had run through the hollow geometry like grain through wood, the thing that had let them descend on 40 worlds with the calm of a hand moving down a page. They had met their own reflection over a cold colony at the quiet end of nowhere, and a thing that has seen its own reflection can never again be quite sure it is alone in the mirror. They edited more carefully now. They tested longer before they committed. They held back the full geometry, the total revision, the one stroke that had finished 40 worlds, because the full commitment was the exact thing the sleepers of Tarn had drunk and returned, and the Unmakers did not know, going into any new sky, whether something else lay beneath it that had also been built to receive. The caution slowed them, the caution weakened them, and the worlds they came to after Tarn, which had begun to wonder what slept beneath them, met an enemy that no longer believed it could not lose, and some of those worlds, for the first time in the long history of the hollow geometry, were not unmade at all, because an enemy that has learned to fear is an enemy that can, at last, be turned away. And the worlds they went to next began to wonder, the way Tarn had never thought to wonder, what might be sleeping under their own oldest ranges, in their own deepest seas, beneath their own quiet places. Most of them found nothing, because most worlds are only worlds. But the wondering itself was a kind of armor, the first armor anyone had ever had against the Unmakers, because a world that wonders what is sleeping beneath it is a world that has stopped believing it can be edited without a fight. And on a few worlds, a very few, the wondering found something, not sleepers of Tarn, not the 11, for there were only ever 11, and they were spoken for, but other old and buried things, left by other lost peoples in other dark ages, answers sent into other futures, by other hands, that had met the Unmakers and understood. Most of those answers were broken, or empty, or had waited too long and forgotten what they were. But here and there, on a world that wondered hard enough and looked deep enough, something old turned over in its long sleep, and the galaxy began to understand that Tarn had not been a miracle, but a sign, that the long defeat of 40 worlds had never been the whole story, that scattered across the dark were other patient ancient things waiting for an enemy committed enough to be turned around. And humanity, which had built a colony on the backs of war gods and never known, learned the lesson best of all, because it was humanity's world that had stood up. Humanity began to look at its own oldest places differently, its own buried ranges and deep cold trenches, and the quiet weathered bones of its older worlds, and to wonder, with a new and careful hope, what else had chosen to sleep beneath the small, loud, fragile people, waiting for the day it would be needed. They did not always find a sleeper, but they found, again and again, that the looking changed them, that a people who believe something ancient and patient and powerful might be watching over them, become a people who try to be worthy of being watched over, and that this, more than any weapon, is what the war gods of Tarn had really given the galaxy. Mara Quill lived to be very old, on the world where the mountains stood up. In her last years, she would walk out to the eastern shelf at dawn, to the place where she had knelt with a core sampler in her hands, and watched the sky stop being a sky, and she would sit and watch the blue come up honest and ordinary over the standing range, and she would think about the morning the rocks studied back. She watched the colony grow, in those years, from 3040 into something larger and warmer and more itself, a people shaped by the thing that had nearly ended them, She watched the girl Seni grow up and take to the deep study Mara had set down. Watched her learn to read the slow turning of the sleepers in their sleep. Watched her become the keeper of the mountains after Mara was gone. Because every generation of Tarn needed someone whose whole work was to honor the 11 and let them rest. She watched Tessa Vorn fly again, year after year, careful always to keep her wings away from the crests. She watched Dr. Adeyemi grow old in the medical bay, where she had refused to stop being a doctor on the morning the rules came apart, and train others to refuse the same way. She watched Joel Hartley govern the colony with a quiet she had never seen in him before, the gray ceiling, the quiet of a man who had stood beneath the end of the world and learned what was worth governing for. And she watched the children, always the children, growing up under the standing range, with the easy, unafraid knowledge that war gods slept beneath their homes, a knowledge that did not frighten them because they had been taught from birth that the war gods were on their side. She told the story to anyone who would listen, the children especially, because the children needed to know what they lived on. She told them about the gray ceiling that came down and stopped 100 meters over her head. She told them about the 11 voices joining into one. She told them about the mountains drinking the unmaking and giving it back. And she always ended the story the same way, with the thing she had understood last and held longest, the thing that was the real shape of what had happened over Tarn. The Unmakers thought they could rewrite anything, she would say, to the wide eyes of children who had grown up on the backs of sleeping war gods. 40 worlds, they rewrote. 40 worlds that never had a chance, because you cannot fight a thing that changes what fighting means. She would look up at the standing range, at the 11 gray peaks turning slowly in their sleep, turning to face the sky. But there was one rule the Unmakers never learned, the oldest rule there is, the rule that was sleeping under our mountains the whole time. You can rewrite anything in the galaxy, anything at all, except a thing that was built to be rewritten, and to give the rewrite back. We were living on 11 of them. We just called them mountains. And the children would look up at the standing range, and the standing range would stand, gray and weathered and patient. 11 war gods wearing mountains on a cold world at the quiet end of nowhere, and somewhere deep beneath the snow, in the deep, slow way that a war god dreams, the sleepers of Tarn would go on watching the sky they had refused to let anyone rewrite. Ready, the way they had been ready for 10,000 years, to stand up again the day the rules were threatened, and to remind whatever came that on Tarn, and on every world that had learned to wonder what slept beneath it, the rules belonged to the people who lived there, and to the patient ancient things that had chosen, long ago, to keep them safe. In the deep places of the galaxy, where the Unmakers had counted 40 worlds and never once needed a word for loss, the count stopped climbing. It did not fall, for the Unmakers were patient and many, and went on editing the worlds that had nothing sleeping beneath them. But it stopped being the only number that mattered, because beside it now there was another number, small and stubborn and impossible, the number of worlds that had stood up, and that number began, here and there, across the long, slow turning of the years, to grow. It had begun at one. It had begun at a cold colony of 3,040 people, at the quiet end of nowhere, who had built their homes on 11 war gods and called them mountains, and who had refused, on the worst morning of their lives, to be erased without a fight. The day the Unmakers rewrote the sky over Tarn, the mountains stood up and rewrote them back. And the sky over Tarn has been blue ever since.